As Keith said, this morning we are carrying along in our series on the names of God. And when I was asked to speak a sermon on the names of God, I remembered back to my years in Sunday school. And one particular Sunday school teacher, his name was Wayne. Wayne was a very tall man. He'd been my primary school teacher and then a year or two later became Wayne as a teacher. He was lovely, but you know, school teachers are scary still a little bit. But anyway, we were doing a series in Sunday school on the names of God. And he asked the question, and I liked to have the right answers. I liked to be seen as smart. He said, "What is God's name?" And you know, we looked around as a class. And you know, Jesus. No. We were a bit shocked. That's heresy in the classroom, not Jesus. Some very, very well read in his Old Testament kid said, "Yahweh." And he's like, no, it's not. We were concerned, we were confused. Then he looked at us very solemnly and he said, "It's Harold." What? That's right, it's Harold. When I was a small child, I was forced to memorize the Lord's Prayer in the King James. "Our Father, which art in heaven, Harold be thy name." We are carrying on our sermon series on the names of God. This morning I'm going to be talking about a name from the book of Genesis, El Roi. Last week, Micaiah introduced this series for us. He started with a brief quote he had found. "Your name is just a noise that your parents like the sound of. Then you identify with it for the rest of your life. Life is weird." And Micaiah suggested, and I think correctly, that perhaps that's not the best way to think about names, that there is a deeper significance to the names we carry than simply mere noises that our parents liked. And so Micaiah talked about the name given, God gives of himself in the book of Exodus, the name Yahweh. You know, Moses has fled Egypt, he was a prince, he has run away and he has left his people behind. But God encounters Moses in a burning bush. And Moses says, you know, "Who should I tell me sent me when I go back to my people in Egypt?" And God says to Moses, "I am who I am." This is what you are to say to the Israelites: "I am has sent you." And Micaiah drew out the significance of this name, that God is self-existence. God defines himself. He does not derive his identity from us. God is simply complete in and of himself. And I'd like you to keep that in mind this morning, because it is an important framing. It also stands something in tension with what I'm going to say this morning. But we start there, that God is self-existence. God is who he is. Now, in the book of Genesis, we'll be looking today, naming is really important. In Genesis chapter 1, God doesn't just create the world, he then names it. He creates the light and the darkness, and then he names them night and day. The same with the earth and the sky and the sea. Then God creates Adam, and Adam's first task when he is looking to find someone suitable for him is to name all of the animals. And then, of course, God calls Abraham and Sarai out of the land of Abram's father and then gives them new names, Abraham and Sarah. And then Jacob, the deceiver, wrestles with God all night. And he walks away with a blessing, a limp, and a brand new name, Israel, he who struggles with God. In each of these occasions, the naming is done from above. God creates the world, and so he names it. He calls people, and he renames them. And Adam named the animals over whom he had dominion. The naming comes from above. And so, of course, God, as we heard last week, names himself because no one has dominion over God. And so now we come to our passage this morning. If you have your Bibles, feel free to turn to Genesis chapter 16. Genesis 16, reading from verse 1. Now Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children, but she had an Egyptian slave named Hagar. So she said to Abram, "The Lord has kept me from having children. Go, sleep with my slave. Perhaps I can build a family through her." Abram agreed to what Sarai had said, and so after Abram had been living in Canaan 10 years, Sarai, his wife, took her Egyptian slave Hagar and gave her to her husband to be his wife. He slept with Hagar and she conceived. When she knew, Hagar, that she was pregnant, she began to despise her mistress. So Sarai said to Abram, "You are responsible for the wrong I am suffering. I put my slave in your arms, and now that she knows she is pregnant, she despises me. May the Lord judge between you and me. Your slave is in your hands, Abram said. Do with her whatever you think is best. Then Sarai mistreated Hagar, and she fled from her. The angel of the Lord found Hagar near a spring in the desert. It was the spring that is beside the road to Shur. And he said, Hagar, son of Sarai, where have you come from, and where are you going? I'm running away from my mistress, Sarai, she answered. Then the angel of the Lord told her, Go back to your mistress and submit to her. The angel added, I will increase your descendants so much that they will be too numerous to count. The angel of the Lord also said to her, You are now pregnant, and you will give birth to a son. You shall name him Ishmael, for the Lord has heard of your misery. He will be a wild donkey of a man, and his hand will be against everyone, and everyone's hand will be against him. He will live in hostility towards all his brothers. She gave this name to the Lord who spoke to her. You are El Roi, you are the God who sees me. For she said, I have now seen the one who sees me. That is why the well was called Beer Lahai Roi. It is still there, between Kadesh and Bered. So Hagar bore Abram a son, and Abram gave the name Ishmael to the son that he had born. Now the story of Hagar and Ishmael doesn't end there. Hagar remained with Abraham, and she has her child Ishmael, who she is raising. And the narrative moves away from them for a while. We were in chapter 16, and then it returns to them in chapter 21. And so we will read a few verses from there as well. By this time in chapter 21, Sarai has had a son herself, Isaac, who will inherit the promise of Abraham. And so we'll read Genesis chapter 21, verse 8. The child Isaac grew and was weaned. And on the day that Isaac was weaned, Abraham held a great feast. But Sarah saw that the son whom Hagar the Egyptian had born to Abraham was mocking. And she said to Abraham, Get rid of that slave woman and her son, for that woman's son will never share in the inheritance with my son, Isaac. The matter distressed Abraham greatly because it concerned his son. But God said to him, Do not be so distressed about the boy and your slave woman. Listen to whatever Sarah tells you, because it is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned. I will make the son of the slave into a nation also, because he is your offspring. Early the next morning, Abraham took some food and a skin of water and gave them to Hagar. He set them on her shoulders and sent her off with the boy. She went on her way and wandered into the desert of Beersheba. When the water in the skin was gone, she put the boy under one of the bushes. Then she went off and sat down, about bow shot away. For she thought, I cannot watch the boy die. And as she sat there, she began to sob. God heard the boy crying, and the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, What is the matter, Hagar? Do not be afraid. God has heard the boy crying as he lies there. Lift the boy up and take him by the hand, for I will make him into a great nation. Then God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. And so she went and filled the skin with water and gave the boy a drink. God was with the boy as he grew up. He lived in the desert and became an archer. While he was living in the desert of Paran, his mother got a wife for him from Egypt. And so essentially ends the story of Hagar and Ishmael in the Bible. We don't hear much from them again, except we know that Ishmael was there to bury his father Abraham at the end. And so this morning our topic is the names of God, and particularly that name in Genesis chapter 16, verse 13. And so I'll read it a few times through from a couple of different versions, because there's some different ways it is framed. So Genesis 16:13. Hagar gave this name to the Lord who spoke to her. You are the God who sees me. For she said, I have now seen the one who sees me. Or in another version. So she named the Lord who spoke to her. You are El Roi. For she said, Have I really seen God and remained alive after seeing him? One final time. Then she called the name of the Lord who spoke to her. You are a God who sees me. For she said, Have I seen him here and lived after he saw me? So what are we to make of such a story in the scriptures? It's certainly a curious side narrative in the broader arc of Genesis. Hagar and Ishmael are not the ones who carry on the line of the promise. And I think even from a distance of thousands of years and differences of culture and language, it's really obvious to all of us that Hagar is a marginal figure in this story. She was not privileged, she was not powerful. In earthly terms, there was no reason to give her consideration. She was a slave who had to submit to her master and her master's wife. She was despised and she was mistreated by Sarah. She was an Egyptian. She was not from the land of the Chaldeans like Abram was. By every metric of her society, she was of no consequence. And in verse 21, when she's sent away, she ends up in the desert, entirely alone, with no hope. She's on the brink of death. And the story is that God did not neglect her. Though every other person in her life had no reason to pay attention to her, God did. And it's easy to overlook quite how significant that is. You know, some critical commentators want to talk about the patriarchal narratives as Israel just justifying how amazing they are. They made up some stories about some ancestors long ago to justify why they are important. But if that was the case, it's a very strange story to have made its way in. Abraham and Sarah do not come off looking good in this story. Now, Hagar herself mistreats and despises her mistress. She is not innocent in this, but this is not a story that makes Israel's history look great. It is a story about God's faithfulness and God's promise to everyone, regardless of circumstance. God sees the marginalized. And secondly, I think what's significant in this story is that God invites genuine relationship. We started off thinking a little bit about Micaiah's sermon last week. God names himself. God defines himself. God does not need us. And so it is fitting that by and large in the scriptures we see God naming other people, not people naming God. But in this story we see something radically different. This marginalized woman, Hagar, sees God and names him. She has the agency in the story. Now, I don't want to get lost in theological weeds about how we relate divine transcendence to human finiteness and us being locked in time. But what is clear here is that God desires real relationships with his people. That Hagar names God is a back and forth relationship, not simply God, though God always acts first. And so we won't solve the tension of how we relate Hagar's agency and God's call, but I want to name that tension, that the scriptures, and especially the story of Hagar and Sarah, gives Hagar agency in her relationship with God. She knows God, she sees God, and she names God. That God who is transcendent, that God who is utterly beyond anything we could know, Hagar sees. And she does ask the question, have I lived, having seen the one who sees me? And we see these themes of the relational nature of God throughout the scriptures in the Old Testament. The scriptures are at times embarrassingly personal. The psalmists are raw, they are real. Job complains and seeks to prosecute God. And then we have the tragic relationship of Hosea and Gomer kind of elaborating on the relationship between God and his people. Our God is a relational God. And I think a third kind of key thing that comes out of this name of God, El Roi, the God who sees, is that God judges. Now the most immediate thing we see about God seeing Hagar is God's compassion. And that too is a form of judgment. God chooses, because he is love, he chooses to save Hagar and bless her and her descendants. But we also have to think about the flip side of this. Hagar has mistreated her mistress, just as Hagar has been mistreated. And Hagar, having encountered the living God who sees all, recognizes that fact. And I think indeed it's implied in the story of Hagar that Hagar too wishes God to vindicate her against her mistress. Hagar is dependent on and sees God's justice. And God is a God who sees not only our deeds, but our hearts. Now, of course, we can all know this in the abstract. We all kind of learn in Sunday school. God knows everything. We can repeat that as a fact. But I think so often we live as if that weren't true. We like to laugh at Jonah in the scriptures who runs away from God as if such a thing were really possible. But we all do it in our own ways in our lives. Those times when we are tired and just don't do the kind thing we know we really ought to, or when we speak a harsh word and don't expect that, we ought to repent for that. I certainly at times fall into this trap of thinking, well, I'm sure God didn't really notice my failings. Perhaps that's a unique flaw of mine, that I pretend it's not such a big deal. But I think when Hagar names God as El Roi, the God who sees, it is a confession. It is a confession of sin, that Hagar knows she has failed, but it is a confession of faith that she knows that God can forgive her. Hagar sees God, knows God, and comes to trust in Him. And moving from the story of Hagar and the God who sees to reflecting on the New Testament, when we encounter our God who became incarnate as Jesus Christ. It was interesting in preparing this sermon. I did not expect to go here, but it became really obvious the parallels and the echoes we see when Jesus encounters the Samaritan woman at the well. You might be familiar with that story. And so I'm going to, in a moment, get us to watch a clip from the TV series The Chosen, in which Jesus encounters another marginalized woman in the Scriptures. Now, some of you might notice that the scene we're about to watch goes somewhat beyond the story in the Gospel of John, chapter 4. So I invite you, if you are so inclined, to take it as a challenge. You can have your scriptures open if you're concerned about such things and spot all the differences. But I think it's a really valuable scene to watch, and then I'll come back with some further thoughts.
Would you give me a drink? Did you hear me?
That bad, huh?
What?
You, would you ask for a drink from me, a Samaritan? And a woman?
I'm sorry. I should have said please.
You know, it's not safe for you to be alone out here.
Nor you. Why haven't you come with others? Why so late in the day? Don't women come to the wells in the cool of the morning?
Yeah, well, none of them will be seen with me, so I have to come out now. In the heat, as you were so kindly reminded me.
Why won't they be seen with you?
Long story.
I'd still like a drink of water if you can spare it.
Amazing what a parched throat will do. Aren't I unclean to you? Won't you be defiled by this vessel?
Maybe some of my people say that about your women, but I don't.
Yeah? And what do you say?
I say if you knew who I am, you'd be asking me for a drink.
Really?
And I will give you living water.
Would. Except that you have nothing to draw water with, and this is a deep well. Besides, what do you need from me if you have your own supply of living water?
Long story.
But Jewish water is better than Samaritan water.
That's not what I
Are
said.
you a better man than our ancestor Jacob, who dug this well? Your water is better than his?
I know Jacob. And everyone who drinks this water will thirst again. But whoever drinks the water that I give him will never be thirsty again.
Wouldn't that be nice?
The water I give will become in a person a spring of water, welling up to eternal life.
Really?
Yes, really.
Prove it.
First, go and call your husband and come back. I will show you both.
I don't have a husband.
You are right. You've had 5 husbands. And the man you're living with now is not your husband.
Oh, I see. You're a prophet. You're here to preach at me.
No.
Usually the one good thing about coming here alone is I can escape being condemned.
I'm not here to condemn you.
I've made mistakes. Too many. But it's men like you who have made it impossible for me to do anything about it.
How?
Our ancestors worshipped on this mountain. But you Jews insist Jerusalem is the only place for true worship.
They say that because the temple is there.
Exactly where we're not allowed.
I'm here to break those barriers. And the time is coming when neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem will you worship the Father.
So, where am I supposed to go when I need God? I've never received anything from God, but I couldn't thank him even if I did.
Anywhere. God is spirit. And the time is coming and is now here that it won't matter where you worship, but only that you do it in spirit and truth. Heart and mind, that is the kind of worshiper he's looking for. It won't matter where you're from or what you've done. Do you believe what I'm telling you?
Until the Messiah comes and explains everything and sorts this mess out, including me, I don't trust in anyone.
You're wrong when you say that you've never received anything from God. This Messiah you speak of, I am he. The first one was named Ramin. You were a woman of purity who was excited to be married. But he wasn't a good man. He hurt you. And it made you question marriage and even the practice of your faith.
Stop it.
The second was Farzad. On your wedding night, his skin smelled like oranges. And to this day, every time you pass by the oranges in the market, you feel guilty for leaving him. Because he was the only truly godly man you've been with. But you felt unworthy.
Why are you doing this?
I have not revealed myself to the public as the Messiah. You are the first. It would be good if you believed me.
You picked the wrong person.
I came to Samaria just to meet you. Do you think it's an accident that I'm here in the middle of the day?
I am rejected by others.
I know. But not by the Messiah.
And you know these things because you are the Christ. I'm going to tell everyone.
I was counting on it.
Spirit and truth.
Spirit and truth.
It won't be all about mountains or temples.
Soon, just the heart.
You promise.
I promise.
This man told me everything I've done. Oh, he must be the Christ.
Hey, wait! Your water! You forgot your
Foxy, a man, he told me everything.
Rabbi, we got food. What would you like?
I have food to eat that you do not know about.
We're going to just wrap up the track there. So I hope you can see some of the parallels with the story of Hagar. Jesus encounters a woman at the well, and she is a marginal figure. Hagar was a slave. This woman is a Samaritan who the Jews considered unclean. She is a Samaritan who the Jews consider unclean, and she is excluded from her own community because of her past. Jesus sees her and he sees all of that about her, yet he does not reject her. Instead, Jesus reaches out and connects with her. Obviously that scene does give details and fleshes out that conversation, but I think it captures the essence of what the biblical story records, is that Jesus sees everything that woman has done and he judges her. And how he judges her is forgiven. That Jesus is not ignorant of what she has done, but nor does she think that defines her. So it is with Hagar when she says that God is El Roi, the God who sees. She confesses that God has seen everything about her circumstances, everything she has done and everything she has suffered. So then, if God, our God, is the God who sees, what does that mean for us? I think a really obvious implication of the story of Hagar is that we too have an obligation to see the marginalized. It's so easy for us to live our lives and exclude those whom we would rather not see. Perhaps all of us have developed a skill of not seeing people when we go on shopping trips who are sitting there in tough circumstances. It's a skill we learn because sometimes it's just harder to notice and to see. We all know that for us as Christians, love is kind of important. God is love, and we imitate God when we love others. Love is not simply emotion, it's an action, but the first step of that action is the discipline of paying attention. God sees even Hagar. We too should see all people in our lives whom are suffering in order to love them. We cannot love them if we don't take the time to see. And then, of course, the writer of the letter of James says, if anyone then knows the good they ought to do and doesn't do it, it is a sin for them. One of the reasons we look is in order to see the good that we ought to do. Ultimately, we know that the God who sees, who met Hagar in her distress, became incarnate as Jesus Christ. He did that to die and to rise again to save us from our sins. And in the person of Jesus, we see the clearest embodiment of the God who met Hagar in the desert. A God who cares for the marginalized, a God who seeks relationship with us regardless of what we have done and regardless of what we have suffered. And we see that God judges us, but he judges us as forgiving. And so I would hope that we would all, this week as we go about our lives, be able to name God as El Roi, the God who sees, and take comfort.